The dust motes danced in the shafts of amber light that pierced the small, leaded window of the cottage, highlighting the stillness of the room where Alara sat in her wingback armchair, the velvet worn smooth at the arms from decades of nervous gripping. Her hands rested in her lap, a topography of her history with veins like prominent blue rivers mapping the journey under paper-thin skin, and knuckles swollen like knots of old oak, a testament to decades of wringing clothes, kneading dough, and holding on to tight when things tried to slip away. At her feet, sitting cross-legged on a braided rag rug, was Leo, 8 years old with eyes the color of wet earth and a stillness that belonged to a much older soul, tracing the pattern on the rug while his attention remained entirely fixed on his grandmother who had been crying earlier. Not loud sobbing, but a silent leak of tears while she stared at her mobile phone, which now lay face down on the side table like a discarded weapon. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of dried lavender and wood smoke, a sharp contrast to the sterile, lemon-scented air of the house she had left 3 days ago. The house where her son, Robert, had stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile she had laid herself 30 years prior, looking at her with eyes that had turned into calculators, void of the warmth she remembered from his childhood, and delivered the ultimatum that shattered her world. He had told her that the market was shifting, that the house was an asset he couldn't just let sit idle, that she was occupying a 4-bedroom capital investment alone, and that effective immediately, her rent would be $1,200 a month, a sum he knew he had to know was nearly double her entire pension, leaving her with the impossible choice of starvation or eviction. She remembered the silence that followed his declaration, a silence so loud it rang in her ears like a struck bell, and she remembered standing up, leaving her half-finished tea on the counter, walking past him without a word to pack her to suitcases, taking only the photos, her husband's watch, and her dignity, while he shouted after her that this was just business, just the way the world worked now. The drive to the old cottage had been a blur of tear-blinded navigation, the ancient vehicle groaning as she pushed it toward the edge of town where her own mother's dilapidated home sat abandoned, a place of drafts and ghosts that Robert had long forgotten existed. But now, sitting in the fading light with Leo, whom Robert had dropped off earlier under the pretense of an urgent conference while ignoring the reality of his mother's displacement, Alara felt the cold seeping into her bones not from the air but from the memory of her son's face. She began to speak to the boy, her voice like dry leaves rustling over gravel, telling him not of the anger but of the love that came before it, transporting them back to a time when the ocean was her neighbor and her husband. Elias was alive, a time when they had nothing but possessed everything. As she spoke, the room seemed to dissolve into the grey mist of the coastline 60 years ago, where a younger version of herself stood on a wind-battered dock waiting for the fishing fleet in a storm, screaming into the gale as the waves swallowed the boats, a memory that served as the first lesson in loss, teaching her that you can love something with all your heart and respect its power, yet it can still swallow you whole without a second thought. She described the moment the captain handed her Elias's empty lunch pail, the moment the hope died and the resilience began, painting a picture for the wide-eyed boy of how she rebuilt her life from the wreckage of grief, moving to the city, working in factories where the noise was deafening and the air was thick with cotton dust, all to build a foundation for the very son who had now cast her out. She told Leo about the fire in the tenements, how she and his grandfather stood on the pavement in their night clothes watching everything they owned turn to ash, and how she learned then that home wasn't walls or furniture, but the hand you held while the world burned, a lesson she feared her son had never learned because she had sheltered him too well from the heat of the flames, protecting him from the very hardships that forge a soul's steel. Meanwhile, in the large, suburban house that Alara had vacated. The silence was becoming a living thing, suffocating and heavy. As Robert paced the living room that was now perfectly staged and perfectly empty, he had expected his mother to negotiate, to cry, to beg, to perhaps offer half the money, which would have justified his dominance and allowed him to play the benevolent savior. But her total capitulation and immediate departure had robbed him of the victory and left him with a gnawing, cold pit in his stomach. He walked into the kitchen where her mug still sat on the counter, a ring of cold tea staining the granite, and for the first time in years, he really looked at the space not as square footage to be monetized, but as the vessel of his history. Noticing the height marks on the doorframe he was planning to paint over, the worn spot on the floor in front of the sink where she had stood for thousands of hours peeling potatoes and washing dishes. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable urge to find some leverage, some document to prove he was right, he went to her old oak desk in the corner of the den, a piece of furniture he intended to throw in a skip, and yanked open the drawers, shuffling through the perfectly organized files of utility bills and medical records until his hand brushed against a worn, leather-bound ledger buried at the back. He pulled it out, the leather cracking under his grip, and opened it, expecting to find Odette's or senile ramblings, but instead found a meticulous record titled Robert's account, not of money he owed her, but of money she had secretly paid for him over the last 30 years, the tuition he thought he had won in a scholarship that was actually her life savings, the bank error that cleared his first credit card debt, the down payment on his first car that she claimed was an inheritance from a non-existent aunt. The numbers were staggering, amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Every cent she had ever earned, scraped together and poured into the whole of his ambition. And on the final page, dated 3 days ago, was a single entry in her shaky script that read, "Rent demanded, $1,200, balance remaining in my heart, infinite. Ability to pay, 0. The realization hit Robert with the force of a physical blow, doubling him over as he clutched the ledger to his chest, the air in the room suddenly too thin to breathe as the monstrous weight of his own greed crushed him. He scrambled for his phone, his fingers trembling so violently he could barely unlock the screen, and dialed her number. The silence of the house amplified by the ringing tone that buzzed in his ear once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. He called again and again, pacing the length of the house like a caged animal, his mind replaying the look on her face when he delivered the ultimatum, a look not of anger but of profound, devastating disappointment, the look of a creator watching her creation fail. He drove to her friend's house, to the community center, to the grocery store, his panic rising with the setting sun, until he remembered the old deed to the cottage in the countryside, a place he had marked as a rotting pile of timber, but which was now the only sanctuary she had left. He jumped into his car, the expensive engine roaring to life, and tore out of the driveway, speeding through the darkening streets while his phone sat on the passenger seat, the screen lighting up with the 3rd or 5th call, the 3rd or 6th call, all unanswered, all echoing into the void he had created. As he drove, the sleek veneer of the successful businessman peeled away, leaving a frightened boy desperate for his mother, realizing that the currency he had spent his life chasing was worthless compared to the currency he had just thrown away. And he prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to since childhood that he wasn't too late, that the cold of the old cottage hadn't taken her, that the stress hadn't stopped her heart, that he could buy back his soul with an apology. Back in the cottage, the wind was howling around the eaves, rattling the loose window panes, but inside the circle of lamplight, there was a fragile peace as Alara finished her story, her hand resting on Leo's head. She looked at her phone, which had been vibrating intermittently for the last 2 hours. The screen lighting up the dark corner with the name Robert, but she made no move to answer it, knowing that some lessons must be learned in the silence, that he needed to sit with the echo of his own voice before he could hear hers. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine cut through the wind, followed by the slam of a door and running footsteps on the gravel path. And then the heavy wooden door of the cottage burst open, revealing Robert, disheveled, tie undone, sweating despite the chill, clutching the leather ledger in one hand. He stopped dead in the doorway, his chest heaving, his eyes adjusting to the dim light until they landed on the tableau of the old woman and the young boy, a scene that looked like a painting of refugees from a war he had started. He fell to his knees on the rough floorboards, the pride finally broken, and held out the ledger, his voice cracking as he whispered the only words that mattered. "I didn't know, Mom, I didn't know," to which Alara simply looked at him, her face an unreadable mask of ancient wisdom, before she slowly extended her hand not to take the money, not to take the ledger, but to beckon him into the warmth, saying, "You knew, Robert, you just forgot. But the rent for this life was paid a long time ago. And it wasn't paid in cash." The silence that followed Robert's confession was not the empty silence of the house he had left, but a living, breathing silence filled with the crackle of the dying fire and the jagged rhythm of his own breathing as he knelt on the rough-hewn floorboards, the knees of his Italian suit absorbing the dust of a century. Alara did not immediately pull him into an embrace, for she knew that cheap forgiveness is often forgotten as quickly as it is given. So she let him stay there for a long moment, the weight of his shame pressing down on him like a physical hand, while Leo watched with wide, confused eyes, tucking himself deeper into the crook of his grandmother's arm as if this sobbing man were a monster and not his father. When Alara finally moved, it was with the slow, deliberate grace of a glacier. She reached out and placed her hand not on his shoulder to comfort him, but under his chin to lift his face to the light, forcing him to look into the eyes of the woman he had tried to evict, revealing a face that was ravaged by time but terrifyingly clear in its judgment. She saw then what she had missed in her own hurt, the dark circles under his eyes that no concealer could hide, the tremor in his hands that wasn't just from the cold, and the sheer, animalistic panic that lurked behind the tears, realizing in that instant that his cruelty hadn't been born of power, but of a weakness so profound he had tried to monetize his own mother to hide it. "It's gone," Robert whispered, the admission tearing out of him like a hook. "It's all gone, Mom, the investments, the leverage, the liquidity. I'm overextended on everything. And if I didn't show the bank an income stream from the house, they were going to call the loans on the business by Monday." The confession hung in the air, transforming him from a tyrant into a frightened child who had broken a vase and was trying to hide the pieces. And suddenly the $1,200 rent wasn't an act of greed, but a frantic, drowning man grabbing at the only life raft he could see. Even if it meant drowning the person he loved most. Alara looked at the ledger in his hand, then at the shivering man, and the anger drained out of her, replaced by a sorrow so deep it felt like the ocean she had left 60 years ago. She stood up, her joints popping in the cold damp of the cottage, and walked over to the small kitchenette to put the kettle on, the mundane domestic act serving as an anchor in the emotional storm. "So you sold me," she said, her voice flat, her back turned to him as she struck a match against the box. "You sold my peace to pay for your war." Robert, he scrambled to his feet, wiping his face with his silk tie, pacing the small room with that frantic energy that made Leo shrink back. "I didn't want to. You don't understand the pressure, Mom. You lived in a world where you worked and you got paid, but my world, It's sharks, it's appearances, if they smell blood. I'm finished. He was gesturing wildly now, the shadows dancing on the peeling wallpaper. I thought if I could just bridge the gap for 2 months. I never meant for you to actually leave. I thought you'd just find the money. Alara turned slowly, the kettle beginning to whistle a low, mournful note behind her. Find the money? She echoed, a sad smile touching her lips. Like I found the money for your tuition? Like I found the money for your first car? Do you think I pulled that from the air, Robert? I scrubbed floors on weekends. I skipped meals. I didn't find money, I bled for it. She poured the water into 3 chipped mugs, the steam rising like ghosts between them. Sit down, she commanded. And for the first time since he was 10 years old, he obeyed immediately, collapsing into a wooden chair that groaned under his weight, looking around the squalid cottage with fresh eyes, seeing the rot in the window frames and the damp patches on the ceiling, and realizing this was where he had sent his mother to die. The narrative frame shifts, the camera of the mind zooming into Robert's memory, triggered by the smell of the damp wood, which smelled exactly like the basement apartment they had lived in when he was 12. A memory he had spent 20 years trying to outrun. He is a boy again, standing in the school cafeteria, the line moving slowly, his stomach cramping with hunger, clutching a bright orange ticket that screams free lunch program, while the other kids hold crisp dollar bills. He remembers the shame burning his cheeks, hot and prickly, as he hands the ticket to the lunch lady who looks at him with pity, a look he hates more than the hunger. He walks to a table, head down, and sees the popular kids laughing, their clothes new, their shoes branded, and in that moment, a vow is forged in the fires of adolescent humiliation, a vow that he will never, ever feel this small again. That he will build a fortress of money so high that pity can never scale the walls. He remembers coming home that day to find Alara singing as she mended a sock for the 10th time, and feeling a surge of irrational anger at her happiness, hating her for being content with poverty, hating her for not wanting more, and that anger became the fuel for his entire life, driving him to take risks, to leverage assets, to buy the big house, to wear the suits, all to bury the boy with the orange ticket. But now, sitting in this broken cottage in his ruined suit, he realized that the fortress he built was made of paper, and the wind was blowing it down, revealing that the frightened boy had been running the show all along. And in his desperation to avoid being poor, he had become something far worse. He had become poor in spirit, back in the present. The temperature in the cottage was dropping as the storm outside intensified, the wind howling like a banshee around the corners of the stone structure. Leo, sensing the shift in his father's energy, slid off the armchair and tentatively approached the table, holding out a small, half-eaten cookie he had been saving. "Papa," he whispered, "are you hungry?" The gesture was so pure, so devoid of the transactional nature of Robert's world, that it broke the last dam of his composure. Robert looked at the cookie, then at his son's innocent face, and burst into fresh tears, pulling the boy into his lap and burying his face in the small, warm neck. "I'm sorry, Leo, I'm so sorry," he sobbed, rocking back and forth while Alara watched from the kitchenette, sipping her tea. She knew that this moment was the crucible. If she stepped in now and fixed it, if she told him it was okay, he would never learn. He would patch the holes in his life with her forgiveness and go back to building his paper fortress. So she let him cry. She let him feel the cold draft on his neck. She let him realize that his Italian suit offered no warmth against the winter. "We cannot stay here tonight," Robert finally said, lifting his head, his voice hoarse. "It's freezing, Mom, the furnace is dead. I can see your breath." He stood up, clutching Leo. "We're going back to the house. I don't care about the bank. I don't care about the eviction. "You are coming home." Alara set her mug down with a sharp click. "No," she said softly. Robert froze. "What?" "Mom, don't be stubborn. It's unsafe here." Alara walked to the window, looking out at the blackness where the lavender bushes were hidden in the dark. "It was unsafe there, too, Robert. Just a different kind of danger. You kicked me out of my home because I was a liability. If I come back now, I am just a guest in your asset. I won't be your mother again until you stop being my landlord." The standoff was broken by a sudden, loud crack from above, followed by the sound of rushing water. A pipe had burst in the attic, unable to withstand the freeze of the unheated house. Icy water began to pour through the ceiling planks in the corner of the room, soaking the rug and splashing onto the hearth. Panic erupted. Robert moved instantly, his business instincts kicking in, shouting commands. Grabbing a bucket from under the sink, throwing his expensive overcoat over the leak to stem the flow, ruining the cashmere instantly. Alara grabbed the towels, and Leo huddled on the dry side of the room. For an hour, they fought the house, a chaotic ballet of bailing water and moving furniture, the three of them united by a common physical enemy. Robert was on his knees, drenched in freezing water, wrestling with a rusted valve under the sink to shut off the main, his knuckles scraping and bleeding against the iron, cursing and shivering. When the water finally stopped, the room was a wreck, puddles reflecting the dim bulb, the air smelling of wet wool and old dust. Robert sat back against the cabinet, soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead, his suit ruined, bleeding from his hand. He looked at Alara, who was equally wet, her grey hair straggling. And then something miraculous happened. Alara started to laugh. It started as a wheeze and grew into a belly laugh, the sound of it echoing off the wet walls. Robert stared at her in shock, then looked at the absurdity of himself, the master of the universe, defeated by a rusted pipe in a shack, and a bubble of hysteria rose in his chest. He started to laugh too. They laughed until they were gasping, the tension of the years washing away with the flood water. The shared misery creating a bond that the sterile perfection of the big house never could. They huddled together that night on the single dry mattress in the back room, wrapped in every blanket Alara could find. There was no heat, so they relied on body warmth. Leo in the middle, Robert on one side, Alara on the other. In the dark, the distinctions of debtor and creditor faded away. Robert lay awake, listening to his mother's shallow breathing, realizing how fragile she actually was. He had always seen her as a pillar, an endless resource to be drawn upon, but lying there, shivering against her thin back, he realized she was just an old woman who had given everything away. The guilt was a physical pain in his gut, sharper than the cold. He thought about the ledger again, lying on the wet table in the other room. He thought about the infinite balance she had written. He realized that he had spent his life trying to buy security, but tonight, with $0 in his pocket and his net worth circling the drain, he felt strangely safer huddled under a moth-eaten quilt with his family than he ever had in his empty mansion. He whispered into the darkness, "I don't know how to fix this, Mom. I really don't. I think I'm going to lose the house. I think I'm going to lose everything." Alara's hand found his in the dark, her grip surprisingly strong. "You can't lose everything, Robert," she whispered back, her voice sleepy but firm. "Because the things that matter can't be taken by a bank. We will plant lavender. We will eat potatoes. We will rebuild. But we will do it together, or we won't do it at all." And as Robert finally drifted into a restless sleep, he dreamed not of stock tickers or foreclosure notices, but of an orange lunch ticket burning in his hand, turning into a flame that warmed the room. And for the first time, he didn't try to put it out. The morning light would bring the harsh reality of the damage, the cold, and the inevitable phone calls from the creditors, but for this one night, the ledger was balanced.